So welcome to the show. I'm your host, Joseph Kappas, and I'm here with Dr. Jerome Lubbe from Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I heard it's still pretty warm down in Atlanta, right?
They're breaking records all the time for heat and humidity. It's definitely living up to its name for sure.
Definitely
Thank God for air conditioning.
Yeah, right. Definitely missing the heat down there though, but you can keep it.
Absolutely.
But so you wanted to talk today about some different aspects of balance as well as childhood, some childhood disorders and emotional health as well, and kind of how all those things interplay, correct?
Yeah, I was thinking some of the things that work really well for the client and the patients and the demographics that we get to see, and really everybody who is trying to be a healthy human being, are some things called the 6 basics, some basics around what it looks like to educate parents and families and even individuals on the way the brain develops, and some very, very common core things we sometimes forget about that can help brain health overall. And then also how those things really help to not only prime but develop and integrate the systems connected to both mental and emotional health, which fortunately are becoming much more open dialogues around what that looks like. But it's interesting. I was talking to somebody this morning, and if you poll every human being and you say, do you have a gauge on your physical health, like not whether or not you are doing everything or you should be doing everything or you haven't done anything lately, can you just give me a litmus on how you're doing physically? Almost everybody can answer that question pretty quickly in terms of their own gauge or their own scale. But when it comes to mental and emotional health, it's a really hard question for people to answer in terms of where they feel like they are, what they can do about it. So you can tie in some pretty basic functional neurology and general healthcare practices for brain hygiene that are pretty helpful at influencing those spaces in healthy ways.
Absolutely. Now, before we dive too deeply into the topic, I'd just like to ask everyone how they got into the field that they did and what got you interested in this particular topic. I guess, what's your story?
Sure. The short version of that is I went to 21 specialists over 9 years in my late teens, early 20s, and spent over $100,000 in the first 5 years of an early marriage. I got married at 21, trying to discover what in the world was happening with the frequency and the intensity of migraines I was experiencing. I was having essentially one migraine every 3 days, or a little over 100 migraines per calendar year. And those were separate from the 200 to 250 headaches that I was having a year. So I'd essentially go about 8 to 10 days out of the year without a headache or without a migraine. Nobody could figure out what was going on. My undergrad is in film and digital animation. I used to do music full time with my brothers here in Atlanta. And I just nobody could figure it out. And what I realized was that the traditional medical community is profoundly gifted at triage and damage control and keeping somebody alive, right? They're really, really good at that. But comprehensive and complex rehab to full recovery, not really something that they're as proficient at. And then you go to the alternative communities. Sorry about that. I got a phone call. When you go to the alternative communities, they're profoundly gifted at being able to do health and wellness and wholeness. But man, they really struggle with dealing with complex cases. So I ended up being an unresolved complex case who wanted to be whole, but really didn't figure out how that happened. So really fell in love with the philosophy and approach of the alternative community that wanted to do something that was a little bit more complex and comprehensive than your standard or traditional alternative care. So I found out about functional neurology, fell in love with it, put way too much time, more than was healthy, into studying it and learning it. Ended up becoming a functional neurologist and then specializing not only in vestibular rehabilitation, concussion, traumatic brain injury, but really, really heavily in being able to work with pediatric cases, nonverbal autism, being able to work with folks that have had pediatric brain injuries, because that demographic is really, really hard to work with. An 8-year-old who can't speak and has never spoken and are very aggressive, whether it be from nonverbal autism or the 10-year-old I saw 2 weeks ago who was run over by a dump truck when he was 5 and everything changed after that. Those kids are really, really hard to work with, similar to folks that are in mental health spaces or emotional health spaces. And I have a history of anxiety and depression that I've worked with for the past 20 years. My grandmother was severely bipolar, and I used to work in a mental hospital for a couple of years. So my personal experience, my lived experience, my professional experience around both pediatric spaces and mental and emotional health spaces allowed me to kind of take all of this stuff around how do we even stand upright in the world and move and do things like balance, and can you improve those things and then also improve somebody's quality of life as it relates to all the things that I just mentioned? Yeah, for sure. You absolutely can.
Yeah. And I was fortunate enough as a student to be able to spend a lot of time with you in your clinic, and I really got to see firsthand the ways that you approach patients and the amazing things that you've been doing with these special populations and these pediatric populations. Can you talk on maybe some of the things that those populations are dealing with? I mean, a lot of nonverbal autistic children, like you spoke of, who may be dealing with, you said, anxieties and depressions and all these things that may come with that.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, the fun thing is when you learn about really complicated neurology and then you distill it into the everyday human experience, if you're talking about somebody who's had a profound traumatic brain injury or you're talking about somebody who's really healthy, in both situations you're talking about, essentially what we do is being a personal trainer for the brain. We're figuring out how to take somebody who's in exceptionally good shape and do performance enhancement without drugs or surgery. You're talking about somebody who's profoundly, struggling with different disabilities or they're differently abled, they've got neurodiversity issues. You're looking at where do we start? Like, how do we show up? And fortunately, categorically, it's actually fairly similar, just to different degrees of intensity and frequency and duration. Meaning, when I do a therapy with somebody, how long am I doing it for? How often am I doing it for? How intense is it when I do it? And that's going to change depending on the person, but categorically tends to have some similarity. For instance, one of the things that I tell all the parents that I work with is there are three primary things that we're going to be working on that fall under one category. And that one category has 5 to 6 major people involved in it from a system standpoint. So the three goals or the three objectives are to make and maintain appropriate eye contact, to make and maintain appropriate posture, and to be able to make appropriate movements in space, like really good coordinated movement. So you're looking at improving the quality of eye contact, you're looking at improving the quality of posture, and you're also looking at improving the quality of movement as a whole, and not only body-based movement, but visual movement. If you do those three things, I mean, you're looking at the core foundational pieces of everything that turned the brain on in the first place. Because if you look at every single kid that has ever been able to form a complete sentence based on deductive reasoning and logic, understanding their environment, every single one of them, or it's fair to say almost everyone, because there are always outliers, every single one of them learned to lift their head, roll over, sit up, stand, crawl, or crawl and then stand, creep and then run, walk and then run. So that process of moving from being just somebody who just entered the world into somebody who can stand upright against gravity and move through that space, every single one of those things is turning the brain on in profoundly important ways. If you see kids that have nonverbal autism, or you see somebody post-concussion and post-head injury, or you see somebody who's dealing with severe PTSD, even from something where they had mental or emotional abuse growing up, but especially physical abuse with physical trauma that affects the brain, every single one of those people is going to change postural components, muscle tone, their ability to make and maintain appropriate eye contact, and how well they move through space. So all of that's really, really important when we go, if I'm going to talk about the basics with somebody, can we talk about the basics of eye movement, posture, and movement in space? Those things are really helpful. And when you look at all of those things categorically, they all fall into how does the brain deal with balance? That's the big heavy-duty category, and balance is how am I effectively engaging in this thing we call gravity, right? Because if you see kids, all they're doing their entire first 2 years of life really is learning how to fall more effectively. And then if you see parents, adults, as they get older into geriatric populations, you're seeing them learn how to fall more effectively, right? The number one thing outside of a car accident for geriatric populations that creates a head injury or creates something that injures them is either a broken hip or a head injury. And those are tied to balance. So balance on the front end, balance on the back end, really, really important. And when we evaluate balance and we look at those things, I mean, the things that are really, really effectively involved in balance, the fancy names are the vestibular system, proprioception, cerebellar, visual, auditory, all of those things are in there. But in simple terms, you're talking about Am I aware that I've even moved? Do I know where I am in space when I move? Is somebody responsible for helping me move in those spaces? And does my vision and my hearing help me do all of that? Yeah, absolutely. All of those things collectively and comprehensively comprise balance. So if I'm evaluating all of those things and seeing where the strengths are, seeing where the weaknesses are, seeing where the opportunities and the blind spots are, and then we just work on figuring out, can we get a baseline and just do performance enhancement, whether you're starting out from scratch or you're in the best shape possible, and kind of navigate all that with everybody.
Right. And in the patient population that you see, obviously you're working with a lot of children who come with parents. What are some of the major concerns and frustrations maybe and goals for the parents of these children?
You know, the biggest thing is you can sum everything up into independence. I think for any patient demographic that we work with, but especially those who can't advocate for themselves or they've got somebody advocating for them, you're trying to increase some, not only quality of life, but quality of life for the purpose of autonomy and independence and self-directed activity. There's a lot of things that we don't take into consideration of how much the family members and the caretakers and the caregivers and the care providers are heavily impacted by the nature of what's happening as a result of someone's lack of independence, not because of their frustration and their irritability that they are in a space where they are the primary care provider for that person, but the sake of, you have to think, as somebody's independence decreases, there's somebody else that has to step in to be able to navigate that with them and support them in that space. And when you look at these kids that are nonverbal, or even adults that are losing their own independence because of all of the diagnoses and all of the spaces and all of the issues that we're working with, I think the sum total is really tied to, are you increasing somebody's quality of life so that you can increase their capacity for independence and forward moving in terms of the experiences that they're engaging in that are personal and relative to that.
Absolutely. And then as the clinician, how do you take the goals of the patient, the goals of the parent, how do you assess for that in the patient and then create a treatment plan to really meet those goals and get the patient where they want to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are 4 primary questions that I ask, and those 4 primary questions lead into 4 primary things that need to be present. The 4 questions are, how did we get here? Where are we going? How do we course correct? And what's our exit strategy? And that leads into, I have to be right in my diagnosis. I have to be right in my intervention. That person has to realistically be capable of change. And then also, which is really, really powerfully important, and it's a little bit of the intangible, is they have to believe that it's possible. Because the placebo and the nocebo effect are very, very powerful pieces. I can be right in my diagnosis, right in my intervention, and also that person can be capable of change. But if they adamantly refuse to believe that there's anything that can change, it won't. If they are really optimistic and they're really engaged, and even if they're pragmatic and they're willing to allow the diagnostics and the statistics and the relative subjective and objective changes to demonstrate that, then you can at least give them the opportunity to be skeptical and to be doubtful and to be disenfranchised. I can raise both hands on that for a lifetime of experience with that. Because, faith is good, but fruit is better. And sometimes you've got to be able to give somebody the evidence that there are things that are changing. But their capacity to eventually believe, or their capacity to resist believing, is very influential in what happens. But when I'm talking about those 4 questions, how did we get here, is so heavily tied to, have I done a proper evaluation of who this person is comprehensively from head to foot? Looking at everything that comprises who they are and going, how many factors are involved? Because everybody's allowed to have more than one problem. And as a result, they're also allowed to have more than one solution. But if I miss the boat on something that is a heavy offender in their system or a heavy factor in their system, it's going to be a lot harder to help them. And then once I take all of that information relative to who they are, not who I need them to, right? My job, I tell every patient that comes in that works with me during an exam, and you saw me say it when I work with new patients, I work for them. How many patients walked into an environment with a clinician and the clinician said, hi, I'm your employee. How can I serve you? That patient is only there because they're paying me to be there, right? So I am their employee for that time. When I'm with them, it's tied to reaching their goals, not my goals, understanding who they are, not who I think they should be, right?
Yeah.
So motivational interviewing and understanding what's happening with that person is profoundly important. But then taking all that information relative to their own personal goals, helping them as the content expert, and the expertise in that space to go, these goals are realistic and these aren't. These are the appropriate ones to start with, and these are the downstream goals. So helping to evaluate that in really healthy ways, so we know where we came from, where we're going. But I think probably the thing that's helped me the most in terms of being able to be effective with the patients that I get to work with and that I'm privileged to be around is there has to be a really intentional conscientiousness about knowing not if, but when you're going to have to course correct. There is no protocol and there is no expectation and there is no forecasting that is good enough to anticipate everything that's going to happen. I can prepare as effectively as possible to pack the car, to help navigate, to resource everybody to get where they're going. I can't account for other drivers. I can't account for road conditions. I can't account for the weather. I can't even account for what's going to break down on their own vehicle in that process. Mm-hmm. So if I don't anticipate a course correction, I am going to miss a course correction, period. It's going to happen. Right. So I have to know how we got there. I have to know where we're going. I have to know how to course correct and be very, very intentional about anticipating that. Even in the middle of the same session that I thought I was going to get what I thought I was going to get and I didn't. And then I think the thing that's been really helpful at the end of that, the fourth question about what's my exit strategy. Man, very rarely do patients go into meetings and conversations with providers and say, what does it look like for us to intentionally plan on no longer needing to do this particular expectation or this particular exercise or therapy or intervention? Because unless they're genetically predisposed that they have to take something like a type 1 diabetic, there's going to be a time that hopefully, if I'm anticipating it, we either hit their goal and they no longer need me or no longer need to do that and we're working towards that intentionally, or it's really helpful for me, and I think this is something that happened to me personally as a patient, which is where my bias comes in so heavily, but I know it happens to a ton of other patients, is there are times when providers keep a patient too long. They need to know that this is where I have realized I am not the next step or the most appropriate continued step for you. How do we build in an exit strategy that says we either met your goals and we need to make new ones, or we need to let you go because you're healthier and you can be independent? Or, you know what, I think I'm just not seeing the appropriate avenue for recovery that's effective. Let me bring a new voice into the conversation or hand you off to somebody that I think is going to be able to carry the baton. Because for me, I think a lot of times in the clinical space, providers anticipate they're going to run the whole race instead of realizing what they are is a section of the race where they're carrying the baton, and it's more appropriate to take the handoff and then to give the handoff when necessary. So just to recap that, how do we get here? Where are we going? How are we course correcting? What's our exit strategy? As we evaluate that, before we even start, like we've done that before we've started, is my diagnosis right? Are my interventions right? Are you capable of change? And then we're constantly evaluating that through healthy, appropriate biomarkers specific to that person. And then are we doing enough to help you believe that that's possible? And if not, do we need to stop? And if you can't, am I not the right person for you? Because that's going to be an important factor as well.
Right. And obviously these patients are multifactorial, and there's a lot of different components of things that they're dealing with. From obviously you do a lot with the neurophysiology component of things in your office, but can you touch on maybe the emotional aspects that also come with that, maybe even the metabolic components that come with that, and those avenues that need to be addressed in order to get them from how did we get here to the exit strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. And an easy way to connect the dots for everybody when they think, well, how does my physiology connect with my mental or emotional space, connects with my metabolic neurochemistry hormone space? That seems like a lot to combine that. Think about any time you have ever walked down a set of stairs and you misjudged the last step. Okay, if you misjudge the last step and you take 2 steps down, you don't go 2 steps down unless you're really just an adrenaline junkie and go, that was awesome. Okay, you skip the step, your adrenaline kicks in, your heart rate goes up, you get flushed, temperature changes, you could sweat, you could hit the floor, balance is affected, you're trying to figure out what's going on, you can't think clearly, you're reacting in that space. All of a sudden you might get upset, you might have to catch your breath. All of that is affecting your balance. It's affecting your mental and emotional state quickly in the immediacy of the moment to keep you alive because you just misjudged the step. And in order to do that, you just slammed the gas pedal on a bunch of neurochemistry and you drained your tank to the degree based on how much fuel you needed to stabilize yourself. Well, if we talk about walking and realize that walking is nothing more than a controlled series of falls, well, so is pretty much everything else in our life, right? we're figuring out how can I navigate these relationship dynamics? How can I navigate this cognitive space? I'm studying and I get 15 minutes in and I'm passing out because the effort is curing my insomnia and I'm exhausted and I'm getting functional narcolepsy because I can't stay awake because the work is so hard to read. When you're looking at all of these spaces, we have to remember that we're integrated people. We affect our fuel supply just based on how we stand up and if we fall in and catch ourselves. Anybody who has a fear of heights, anybody who's ever had a car change lanes into them and they had that surge of adrenaline, anybody who's ever fallen asleep exhausted, had a profoundly good night of sleep and woken up reborn, understands that our neurochemistry is heavily tied into how we're functioning. Our metabolic capacity is a fancy way of saying what's our fuel supply, how much gas is in the tank. So all of these things are really heavily connected. So when I'm looking at a patient, really oversimplified, I'm looking at the balance. I'm looking at those 5 systems that we talked about to say, how's everybody doing in that space? Because I know if I'm fighting to stand upright or I'm putting more effort subconsciously that I'm not even aware of being able to walk and be stable, I'm running out of the gas that I need to have a hard conversation. I'm running out of the gas to spend the extra 45 minutes doing the work that I need because that cognitive load is demanding. But I ran out of fuel just going for the walk that I went for earlier this morning because I'm not stable. Or because I know my vision is so heavily involved, just walk around in the dark. See what happens as soon as you close your eyes and you try to navigate a space. Yeah. Your vision is a massive fuel hog. So if my vision is not working as well as it can be, my eyes are not yoked and they're not moving together, or I have difficulty with depth perception, or I have difficulty with the perception of movement in a car and I get car sick. I guarantee you somebody who's getting car sick is having issues with anxiety that they don't know about because their system's anxious all the time because they don't feel stable. Yeah. Or if you look at somebody from a sensory standpoint, there's not a single patient that I've worked with to date that is hypersensitive to touch in terms of ticklishness that doesn't also have a cofactor of anxiety. Because their sensory system, the largest organ in their body, which is their skin, is hypersensitive all day long. So if you go to tickle them, they don't go, man, this is, or you do what's called a plantar reflex, where you stroke the bottom of the foot to check that reflex, and they have this huge withdrawal response. That's not a person that goes, man, that felt calming. It increases the anxiety. So what happens when we talk to people and go, you came here because you're hypersensitive to touch and you're having a sensory processing disorder. But if we get rid of your hypersensitivity to touch, does it actually stabilize your anxiety? And as a result of doing that, does it improve your gut function and your immune function and your neurochemistry because you're not allocating resources to tightening up because you think something's going to touch you? Yeah, I mean, you can make that argument pretty easily.
Yeah. And then you had mentioned the plantar reflex, the pathological reflex. We've touched on that in some previous podcasts a little bit with these, not the pathological reflexes, but the primitive reflexes. Can you touch on maybe that a little bit, seeing that in your office, and how that relates to development and how some of these patients may still have these reflexes?
Yeah, absolutely. And forgive me, my phone is letting me know that I'm running low on battery, but we should be okay. Yeah, you know, the interesting thing when you look at these primitive reflexes, and there's a lot of them, but one of them is, you know, if somebody touches the bottom of the foot and they pull away, or you touch the bottom of the foot and just the big toe goes up, or you touch some part of the leg and the calf and you get that similar response. All of those things, I think one of the things that's really helpful for patients and family members to understand is all of that is actually, in fact, normal when you're the appropriate age. So looking at those sort of things and going, okay, unless you had a head injury, where that becomes a pathological sign of a malfunction in the brain, if it's somebody who has a sustained reflex or it's something that's continued past the point of being necessary, in a really oversimplified way, you're just basically saying that was a conversation where that didn't get integrated and the brain still thinks it's necessary. It still thinks it's important and it's relevant to the conversation. So going back and saying, if we understand how the brain develops, especially obviously in pediatrics, and that's still there, first off saying it doesn't mean that something's profoundly wrong. It means that something hasn't been integrated and skill hasn't been developed, and you don't have enough leadership in place to say, hey, I appreciate that, but we no longer need you. You can take a break. We'll handle it from here. And a lot of the times when you're looking at plantar reflexes, or you're looking at toe walking, or you're looking at changes in postural tone, a lot of that toe walking is very heavily tied to hypersensitivity on the bottom of the feet, saying, I don't want to put my feet down, or a postural response of going, where am I in space? I have a change in what's known as a center of pressure, so I'm constantly leaning in different places. And then if you work on somebody's balance and you reintegrate that part of the brain that deals with sensation and touch, a lot of those reflexes automatically go away, because if you look at everybody and you do a really thorough case history and a case review, you're going to see things come up like, how much did they crawl? How much were they able to cross the midline? How much were they able to really stand upright and be straight? How clumsy were they? How much were they able to make eye contact and do two things at once, like eat food or cut food with both hands? You know, all of these things, what we take for granted as really basic activities in how kids develop. Oftentimes what you're doing is taking parents back to those milestones and going, can I reinforce your capacity to do something like an elliptical machine? Can I reinforce your capacity to do something like walk on a balance beam? Can I reinforce your capacity to do something like crawl up and down stairs and be able to activate how all four limbs work together? You know, those are really practical ways that when you send somebody home and you say, I want you to paint a figure eight with your arm, or I want you to climb up and down the stairs, you know, on all fours, that sounds strange, but then all of a sudden you see these reflexes go away, because those systems that are designed to crawling mechanisms and touch mechanisms and control and active engagement, they just never really turned on to the degree that they could have. You know, right. So you help go back and kind of do a performance review on one of the employees that really didn't get onboarded properly, which happens all the time in companies. We just don't realize the brain is set up just like a company. It's developed from the bottom up, like the actual hardware, and then it's managed from the top down, like the executive team, all the way down through all the employees. So majority of the time for every human being on the planet, it's a communication issue and it's a leadership issue. And it may be that leadership was never brought on, and that's a nonverbal autism. Or it may be that leadership is on vacation, which can sometimes be a lack of motivation. Or leadership has no idea how to take a break and clock out, and now you're dealing with adrenal fatigue, right? So it's one of those things that we just keep looking at those conversations around how everybody's communicating and see who's not speaking loud enough and who's speaking too much. Because, you know, really simply put, you can explain everything in neurology through a Goldilocks phenomenon. It's either too much, too little, or just right. And if it's too much, you're probably not going to help anybody by hitting the gas. And if it's too little, probably not going to help anybody by asking them to slow down, right?
Yeah.
So.
And then I think having these tests that you can see in the patient and the patient's family can see, such as, you know, these reflexes or another type of objective finding that you may use, and then you give them these complex movements or these other therapies that you were mentioning earlier, and then you're able to make substantial changes in that. Then, you know, that's something immediate and visible that patients can see, and they know that the brain is making changes, and what you're doing is really having a profound effect on that patient.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you've got to, at the end of the day, and this is my experience too, and I'm sure it's yours, if you don't make it really practical and easy to implement at home, you're wasting people's time, money, and effort. It's got to be something to do without you, because the codependency between a patient and doctor relationship is not fair to the patient. It's fair to the doctor if you're trying to make a business effort. It's not fair to the patient if you're actually trying to be independence. That's just the truth of it. So if you don't figure out a way to take the personal trainer mindset of I'm coaching and helping and facilitating to make sure that you don't injure yourself, and I can hand you the keys to this car and you can drive without me sooner than later, but based on it being appropriate, then I want you to come back to me as you need. But if you're only exercising when you're with me, that's not going to do anybody any good, right? So one of the things that I mentioned, and we mentioned it at the beginning of the call, or just before we started the call, is I recommend to everybody what's called the 6 basics, or what I refer to as the 6 basics. They're very obvious, and they seem very, very asinine in terms of how simple they are. But I've never met a single patient to date that I've asked this question, and all of them can check off the boxes and say, yeah, I do all 6 of those to the degree that you're talking about every single day. So there's opportunity there. It's not a missed space. It's not a problem. It's not a mistake. It's not that they're failing or insufficient. It's just, it's an opportunity, right? And the 6 basics are move, eat, sleep, rest, breathe, and hydrate. Okay? So move, sleep, eat, rest, breathe, and hydrate. What you're talking about that is, are people drinking enough water? Are they drinking half of their body weight in ounces a day? They should be. And in fact, if they're dealing with a lot of other issues, it might not be bad to overcompensate. You can drink too much water, but it's safe to say every human being can handle a gallon a day without too many issues, but at least half their body weight in ounces. So if I'm 200 pounds, I drink 100 ounces of water. It's profound how many pain patients and migraine patients I've worked with that the number one thing that helps to take the edge off of their migraines, even more so than their prescriptions, is teaching them really, really good breathing techniques. Because they're so tight that they're cervicogenic and inflammatory pain that's actually feeding forward into that system and making them hypersensitive to pain, is because they have no idea how to take a deep breath. They have no idea how to let go, right? That's a huge factor. I can raise both hands on knowing what that feels like. And then how do you have an anti-inflammatory diet? There are so many diets in the market, but are you making an effort to eat anti-inflammatory food in whatever way works best for you? And if you don't know, if you consulted with somebody who can give you that feedback. And then from the rest standpoint, the difference between rest and sleep is rest is voluntary, sleep is involuntary. Rest you have to actively choose to do to be able to engage or to be able to disengage and choose to what degree is appropriate for you. If you are going all day or you don't get engaged enough, are you resting too much? Are you not resting enough? Right? What does it look like to do a meditation practice or a mindfulness practice or something like Headspace or Calm to catch your breath and disconnect? A really easy way to do that is a Pomodoro technique. Work for 25 minutes, take a 5-minute break, work for another 25 minutes. Your brain, no matter how gifted you are, it's a law of diminishing returns. It's only capable of taking so much in. And that's very different than sleep. But sleep is involuntary. You can't actually choose to go to sleep. You can't even choose to wake up. You can only choose to create an environment that increases sleep hygiene and goes, is this going to give me a higher probability of sleep? Sure. But sleep is involuntary. So sleep hygiene, I don't care. I will go to bat with anybody on the planet. There is no better medicine on the planet that has ever been made compared to any pharmaceutical than what your body can naturally do during a good night of sleep. And if you want to test it, try not to sleep for 3 days. See what happens to you, who you become, and what happens to your body. Then get one really good night of sleep and see if you don't feel reborn. Yeah. Your body is profoundly good at rejuvenating itself just based off of going, how's my sleep been? And then the last one, because we mentioned breathe, hydrate, rest, sleep, eat. The last one is how do you move? And like we just mentioned, movement at the beginning of life and movement at the end of life is the name of the game for turning the brain on or keeping it alive. But if you want to make it healthy through the process of all of that space in between, the dash that they talk about, your birth date, when you died, the dash between those spaces, the dash is important. When you look at blue zone studies, which are studying centenarians, the only core common factor of every demographic that had a higher number of people who lived to be 100 is 15 to 17,000 daily steps, active movement. There's not a single population that lived to be 100 that has exercise as a part of their daily regimen. We have glorified the idea, and I'm not saying exercise isn't helpful. Exercise is profoundly helpful. But if you abuse it, you will lose it. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. So being 200 pounds overweight can be as damaging to your system as excessive exercise because you're damaging the system to the point that it's actually going to fail, right? Yeah. You have to find a happy balance, and all of the research shows if you do active daily integrated movement like basic walking, 15 to 17,000 steps a day, that is the only core common factor of every people group that was studied that had a high density or a high probability of being 100 that was a part of the equation, right? So those 6 basics are so helpful, and everybody can do that. Are you conscientious of what you're eating, your breathing, how you sleep, how you rest, how you hydrate, how you move, right? Those things are things that we can do as regular activities of daily living, which is one of the metrics that we check as providers.
Absolutely. And that was so really eloquently put in the way that you were able to combine or just to lay out those 6 important things, and the way that you're able to really focus on them with each individual patient, I think is great. And everybody should focus on all 6 of those categories and really take a step back and think, am I doing all that I can in this particular category to, be the best I can in that category to provide myself with ultimate health. So that's great. Dr. Jerome.
Absolutely. And one
go ahead.
Just at the end for just to close out there, one of the things that I think is also really important for everybody across the board is a healthy expectation. Mm-hmm. And if we look at anything in our lives that we invest time, money, or effort into, if we were working a really consistent career-based job or we were investing in the stock market, in both of those spaces, a 3 to 5% growth year over year is profoundly effective. People who are like, that's a 5% return year over year over year because you know it's going to get compound interest, or that job is giving me a 3 to 5% raise year over year over year, and I'm getting compound interest. I think one of the things that's really important as we close the conversation is to help people understand, if your body has a change too quickly, it will think that something's wrong. 92% of lottery winners are bankrupt within 2 years. Over 80% of people who get geriatric bypass surgeries gain the weight back and more within 2 years. So if we don't have a healthy expectation around growth, and us as providers and patients are saying, what is a healthy, steady rate of growth for me in my particular space, I think a really appropriate and healthy expectation year over year for a self-care mindset versus a self-help mindset is throw away the idea of 21 days to a breakthrough. It's an unhealthy approach, and introduce what is 3 to 5% of annual growth look like for me as an individual in each respective areas, and your probability of not only achieving it but maintaining it and accelerating it go way up.
Yeah, and I love the analogy of the compound interest because, like you said, we're not going to make dramatic changes in 21 days or a couple of weeks. This is going to be small changes that compound over years and years of a eventually healthier and healthier life. And I think that's the best way to do it. Absolutely. So we have a few more minutes left. I just wanted to give you the chance to give us any closing thoughts that you might have, anything that we may have missed to cover. This is your chance to
awesome. I appreciate it. I was just checking quick there. My phone has 3% battery, so let's see what we can do before it dies. It's metabolic capacity, right? That's what we're doing. We're figuring out what we can fit. I think probably the closing thought that comes to mind for me is for not only us as providers, but the people who are listening, who are patients, to come back to that idea of you're allowed to have more than one problem. You're allowed to have more than one. I think the heart of until shocks from patients is how many times, almost every time somebody says, you're the first person who has sat down and comprehensively understood what's going on. You're the first person who asked questions. You're the first person who didn't interrupt. You're the first person who let me go for longer than 10 minutes without telling me that we need to move on. And I think the heart of that and the point of that is oftentimes, especially in today's culture, we anticipate that there's going to be a turnkey, plug-and-play fast food option to fix something that's pretty comprehensive. And I'm not saying anything against anybody who loves fast food, but nobody has ever looked at fast food and gone, that's going to be my healthy avenue to success, right? Fast food makes me healthy. So anytime we're looking at these things, I think we have to give ourselves a lot of compassion and a lot of grace, both from the provider to the patient and the patient to themselves, and going, man, if it feels complicated and it doesn't feel like you've done as much as you can, or you haven't had the resources to effectively evaluate everything that's going on, what does it look like to step back and take a look at the bigger picture and try and see the forest for the trees? And if you don't know how to do that, working with somebody like, the Neurological Wellness Institute and what we do at Thrive Neuro Health here in Atlanta, I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. Thank you. I think that's where the opportunity lies in going. If you look at a really basic evaluation or basic appreciation for how neurology works, you're saying, if I am trying to change my outcome, neurology is based on an input, a process, and an outcome. That's it. The sum total is what's coming in, how's the body and the brain working with it, what's it do with it, how's it outcome. So if the outcome is not what you want, you have two options. You either have to change the input or you have to change the process. If you are changing your inputs legitimately and you're not changing your outcome, it may be helpful to go to somebody like us who can help you figure out how to change the process. Absolutely. It's a really helpful way. I think a lot of people are changing their inputs and they're not getting an effective change in their outcome. And it's because not all of us are raised with an understanding of, vision really heavily affects balance, and balance really heavily affects anxiety. So going to people who are content experts and going, what is that central process? How does all of this really integrate with each other? And giving yourself the grace and the compassion to go, if you haven't figured it out as a patient, trust me, I get it. And that's okay. And if we can't figure it out as providers, it's a complex system. Yeah. So you know what? I think that.
Well, that leads me into my final question, in that how can patients, how can listeners, viewers find more about you, your clinic, and maybe any other projects that you're working on?
Yeah, there's a lot of different things going. I run a couple of different content, and I wrote a brain-based model of the Enneagram, which is connected to functional neurology, all sorts of different things. But both the clinic both the whole identity work, both the Thrive neurotheology work, everything that happens in that space, you can simply go to drjerome.com, which is just drjerome.com.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Jerome, thank you very much again for taking the time to talk with me. It's been a pleasure to get to speak with you again. I'm glad everything's going well. I'll let you go before your phone dies, but again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity, Joseph. I appreciate it, sir.
Of course.
Or I should say Dr. Coppis.
Yeah.
Because the last time you were here, Joseph, I got to say Dr. Coppis. Congratulations. See, it still makes me feel good, right? It's a limbic attachment.
Thank you. That's all right.
Thank you, Dr. Coppis.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Well, this has been your host, Joseph Coppis from the Neuro Wellness Podcast. Be well.